welcome again to this, what we call the President's Forum, Leadership, a View from the Top. And we are very, very honored to have Dr. Michael Lindsay to join us today. Michael, let's give a big welcome. We find in many ways we share some common values, some common goals. We are more like a residential type liberal arts college. Besides professional training, we also nurture our students to be, kind of pursuing, we call the liberal approach to life. So today, Michael will share his 10-year study. He interviewed 550, he called it the platinum leaders in the United States, including 2 former US presidents. Right? So he would really share his framework on how to tap into all these important, influential, sometimes we call extraordinary leaders of the world. How they rise up, how they handle challenges, how they handle people, how to inspire the colleagues, how to really pursue life beyond work, how to balance family, work, and life. There's so many things we can learn from his 10-year study.
It's a great pleasure to be here with you today, and I look forward to hearing some of your questions. As President Ho mentioned, this is the result of a 10-year study that I conducted. It started as my doctoral dissertation at Princeton, continued for 5 years while I was a faculty member at Rice University in Houston, Texas, and then I moved into the presidency at Gordon. And so it was much like giving birth to a child, but instead of 9 months, it was 10 years. Some of the key insights that I learned from interviewing some of the top leaders, global leaders, who had influence on so many different institutions. As President Ho mentioned, the study includes interviews, face-to-face interviews, with former US Presidents Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush. It also includes interviews with US Cabinet Secretaries like James Baker, Condoleezza Rice, and Colin Powell, as well as about 80 other senior government officials. It includes interviews with 250 CEOs of some of the largest organizations. The CEOs of major financial companies like Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, as well as 20% of the Fortune 100 CEOs. It includes interviews with 250 heads of nonprofit organizations or NGOs, as well as the presidents of major research universities, like the presidents of Harvard, Stanford, and Princeton. And altogether, it is formed in a single book that was published called View from the Top. And this afternoon, what I'd like to do is just share with you some of the key insights that I learned, 3 major leadership trajectories based upon all of this study that was conducted. I work with college students, and college students today have a love-hate relationship with institutions. They don't like big business or big companies, and yet at the same time they have a strong entrepreneurial interest in starting companies or starting new ventures, which of course, if they are successful, become big companies or big ventures. And so institutions are incredibly important because, the truth be told, the kinds of problems that we face in society today require large institutional solutions. That we must have large institutions to be able to address some of the challenges that we face, like environmental and stewardship kinds of issues, economic challenges. How do you lift an entire planet out of poverty? It requires large institutions, because decisions are made by individuals, not impersonal institutions. Institutions are actually shaped by individual lives of leaders. And that's why, if you want to have a global reach, you have to have that kind of institutional connection. The second form of leadership I found over the course of my research is not just institutional leadership, but is also what we call symbolic leadership. There may have been a time in space where the individual leader could separate his or her professional life from his or her personal identity. But that is no longer the case. You no longer can actually lead institutions without having a personal commitment and personal involvement. For good or for ill, you are the job you do. Who is this? One of the most recognized American faces, Steve Jobs, founder and longtime CEO of Apple Computer. Steve Jobs is representative of a whole generation of leaders that you identify the company with the person. He has such iconic status that you immediately recognize him even though he's been dead for several years. What I found over my research is that leaders have an outsized influence in shaping the culture of their institutions. And that is why there has to be alignment between the individual personality of the leader and the personality of the institution and what that institution needs. There's also something very interesting because you can see differences between different cultural contexts. For example, does anyone know what is the most common profession for an elected official in the United States?
Lawyer.
Lawyer, law. Very common that if someone is going to be a U.S. congressman or a senator or president of the United States, they've had a background in law. Does anyone know what the most common professional background is for a public official in China? Engineering. If you want to know the difference between the United States and China, look no further than that. Right? Lawyers are great communicators, they are idealists, and they work from first principles. Engineers are problem solvers. They're pragmatic. They're not so much interested in philosophical underpinnings, they're interested in figuring out what works. You can also see this happening over time. 500 years ago, if you wanted to be a political figure, a political leader, there was one trait that you had to have more than any other trait. And it didn't matter if you were here in Asia, or if you're in North America, Europe, or Africa. You had to have this trait in order to be a political figure. What was that trait 500 years ago, in 1515?
Good family.
Good family, that's a good guess. Family mattered, but actually that's not the trait.
Religion.
Not religion, although religion could matter. It's more of a personality or a skill or an ability I'm looking for.
Military skill.
Yes, the ability to fight. You had to be a warrior. It did not matter where you were. You had to be physically strong, able to fight, and having military courage. That conferred upon you a degree of legitimacy that would in turn help you become a political figure. Today, you don't have to be a great fighter or physically strong in order to be a government leader. What is the skill that you have to have if you're going to be a senior leader in government today? What would you guess? Cunning? Well, let's frame that in a little bit more positive way. Not so much cunning, but you have to have a particular kind of communication skill, and that is persuasion. You have to be able to persuade. And it doesn't matter if you are in Hong Kong or if you're in Boston. The third kind of leadership that I want to share today is what I call in the book platinum leadership. Platinum is seen as a valuable mineral. But here's the interesting thing. Platinum is also a very durable material. You can heat it up to very high temperature and it does not melt. It also does not tarnish. It has properties that will stay strong over a long period of time. I found that 22% of the people that I interviewed, about 120 of the 550 people, were truly outstanding leaders. They not only achieved prominent positions, but they exercised their leadership in a way that inspired confidence and trust of their followers over many years. So also, if you want to learn leadership, you study those people who are great leaders and how they make it work. There are a couple of key characteristics. One is that great leaders are relational entrepreneurs. They are very gifted at building connections, at setting up relationships, at building bridges. They can come into this room and connect with many different kinds of people. Now, it is a mistake to assume that great leaders are always extroverted or outgoing. They may not be. You can be an introvert and be a great leader. But to be a great leader, you have to be able to build connections with people. It's interesting because over the course of my research, I found that those people who are some of the most effective leaders embody what I call a liberal arts approach to life. The liberal arts approach in higher education prizes breadth of knowledge over depth. It says it's important to be an educated person for you to be conversant or knowledgeable about many different subjects. So you need to understand mathematics and literature, biology and physics. You need to be able to speak a foreign language, but also know history. It's a breadth of knowledge and understanding. So also I found that in the research that I conducted, those people who are great leaders were conversant on many different subjects. So that if you drop them in a room here at Hang Seng Management College, or if you dropped them off at the airport, they could find a way of building a connection with virtually anybody. Can you guess what subject matter would be the great bridge builder in societies today? Sorry? Language. That's a good one, but it's not language. Family is always good, but it's not family.
Food.
Food's a good guess, but that's not it. Sports. That's it. Sport is the great connector. And the interesting thing is that you don't have to know a lot about sport. You just have to have enough to start the conversation. Global influence depends upon a constellation of personal relationships and ability to make friends. And that's one of the key things that I found over the course of my research. And there are many examples of how people drew upon personal stories in very significant decisions and built those connections over the long haul.
Liberal arts college is popular in the States, but in Hong Kong it's not. And if you have a liberal arts degree, say from Gordon College, how do you convince the companies that I would like to work with to say this is a good education that although they might not be leaders in the beginning, those are good training? Can you share with us some of the experiences that you see in the USA? Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Albert. Well, one thing that I cite, and I cite it frequently from my research, is that 73% of the people that I interviewed were actually liberal arts graduates from undergraduate. So 3 out of 4 people who go on to be the most significant leaders over major institutions, their undergraduate training was in the liberal arts. Why is that? Colin Powell said to me, there is a reason why we call the top military officers in the US Army, we call them generals. The reason is because you have to have a general understanding. The higher up you move within an organization, the wider your perspective has to be. It is only in that critical decade of the 20s where you develop the sensibilities of that wide generalist orientation that will sustain you in your 50s and 60s when you actually have to be in that generalist role as a CEO. The reason why the liberal arts education and that approach is actually superior to a more narrower field is because it is during your college years that you develop the sensibilities that you will draw upon for the rest of your life to actually be a great leader. Actually, some of the most important scientific discoveries of our lifetimes have been made by people who built connections between science and other disciplines and other fields. Francis Collins led the 5 research teams that mapped the human genome. The Human Genome Project is far and away the most significant scientific discovery of our lifetime. And he credits his ability to build connections between science and music. He's actually a musician. He says it is the ability to think about the DNA of the individual human cells as having a musical quality, the ability to sort of map out like a concerto. He said that's how we really broke through in the 1990s. So if the world-class scientific researcher says that liberal arts approach is what allowed him to succeed, far be it from us to actually contest it. I think that that's actually what I have found is that liberal arts approach really makes a difference. You're exactly right, Albert, that when you're talking about recent college graduates, the first job, maybe the liberal arts graduate is not going to have the highest paying job when they graduate. But I am actually convinced that over the lifetime, it's that liberal arts approach to life that pays the biggest dividends in leadership formation.
However, when we come to our Chinese culture, what I have mentioned, the family background may be much more important than your ability to fight.
Yeah.
No matter from 500 years ago or nowadays. So what are you going to address this kind of phenomenon or the fact in our Chinese society.
Are most of your interviewees from rich families?
No, actually they're not. Most of the interviewees that I interviewed were from middle-class families, and I had a number of people who were from lower-class and working-class families. I would say that family background mattered a lot more 100 years ago than it does today. And the reason is because education has created opportunities for mobility that were unimaginable even 100 years ago. I think that you are right that family does matter. I think it's less a function of East versus West. It's more of a function of highly developed society and a developing society. That we see that in developing, economically developing environments, some of the previous markers of prestige and distinction continue to have a bigger influence than they do in a highly or fully developed economic culture. And the reason is because you find that there are other mechanisms for mobility in the highly developed culture that you don't have. For example, I would venture to say that family background matters less in Hong Kong today than it would, say, in Mongolia. It's not to, I should also say, it's not to say family origin doesn't matter. Is it helpful to be from a rich family? Absolutely, it is. The reason is because you have many more opportunities to do other things. You can have enrichment opportunities, you can have special summer programs, you can travel more easily. Life is much more comfortable if you have money. But it was striking to me that out of these 550 people, I actually found that there was nothing that I could think of, and I'm a sociologist, so I think a lot about the family. There was not a single variable that I could measure and then test that ended up having a significant relationship on one's likelihood later on. Would it be different if I were to do this study in another cultural context? Absolutely. I'm sure that it probably would. At the same time, I think that we have to recognize that there are many other factors that have come to be more prominent. And actually what we see is that those 20s and 30s, really your early professional developments and experiences, those are probably the most profound regardless of where you are.
Interestingly, I wrote an article about the youth social mobility in Hong Kong. And I did some multiple regression in finding socio-economic background did affect the mobility significantly. So in some sense, we cannot deny the family background have something to do with someone's career path, but mostly at the beginning. Another very significant variable is the education attainment. In fact, we believe, especially like our college, we try all our best to give more equal opportunities for the lower class in terms of family background. We want to attract more those students to come, not because they cannot pay the tuition fee. We try to provide them all kind of aid, financial aid, and also provide them all kind of opportunity to pursue exchange, to pursue internship outside, so that they can become more equal starter when they leave the college. That's something education can help, I believe.
What we found is a phenomenon that has been written a lot about in sociology, is the concept of accumulated advantage. And so there is accumulated advantage that can start in your family of origin, that can continue, that has that compounding effect. But if I could just pause and say, the more interesting finding to me about family life was not about your family of origin, but what actually was your current family while you're in leadership. So here's an interesting finding. 96% of the people I interviewed were married at the time of the interview. When you think about in national average in the US, about half the people would be married. But actually 96%, so they were almost twice as likely to be married as the general population. Now they weren't always their first marriages, but there was a concept or an idea that leadership actually craves companionship.
Steve Jobs had made an icon on Apple, and but he has passed away a few years ago. And I want to know, is it the responsibility of the role of the board of the directors or the Steve Jobs himself to develop the next generations of business in a global environment, or how to succeed?
That's a great question. As it turned out, I never got a chance to interview Steve Jobs. I actually interviewed the chairman of the board of Apple and the person who was Steve Jobs' executive coach. So it was interesting to hear. He had a very unique perspective. And Jobs in some ways is idiosyncratic, so he has a sort of iconic status which is very unusual for a business leader. But both Steve Jobs and the board of directors cared a great deal of who was going to succeed him. And actually, this is the great problem of charismatic figures, is how do you transform the routinization of charisma? So the process in which it becomes routine in the organization. So Apple doesn't die when Steve Jobs passes away. So how can it continue? So Steve Jobs was very influential in choosing Tim Cook as his successor, in setting that up. And I have to say that probably leadership succession is one of the most important duties that's actually shared between the CEO and the board. And the reason is because the board understands what is needed for the institution, but the CEO is far better positioned to assess if there are internal candidates who can succeed in that front. So what happens is that the CEO is responsible for developing a pipeline of people. And I would say this is actually one of the most important leadership lessons, is how do you make sure that you develop a deep bench, a long sort of group of people who could actually succeed you. And that's actually one of the greatest testaments of leadership, is if you have people who are already in place within the organization, who have the skill, ability, and perspective to be able to succeed you or not. But it also requires the board, because oftentimes the leader has a very different idea of who he or she wants to succeed, and that may or may not be the right person. And that's why the decision actually isn't the CEO's, it belongs to the board. And I also say the one big blind spot that CEOs face is that they tend to believe that the leader that is needed for a company is the same kind of person who leads the company today, when in fact institutions go through different eras of influence and needs. And so the leader for Apple today is likely not the leader who is needed 25 years from now. And so that's probably the big challenge, is that the board's job is to be thinking about what will we need 5, 10 years from now. And that very well may not be the person we have in place right now.
My question for you is, we've talked about how leadership, it being in a leadership position, you're going to be exerting a lot of influence and hopefully building up institutions in a positive way. Did any of your interviewees, I'm sure they did at times, have a difficulty, a crisis of conscience in doing the right thing? Because part of that influence is being sure that you're responsible with that power.
Yeah, a couple of interesting points. Of the 550 people I interviewed, 100% of them were able to talk about a significant crisis that occurred in their life. So JP Morgan Chase, Jamie Dimon, talks about getting fired and what it was like to go home and realize he didn't have a job. And there are many examples of leaders that I interviewed who experienced either a personal or professional crisis, which ended up having a very significant influence on their life. And it's interesting because we tend to think about crises as shaping us in profound ways. Actually, I concluded that crisis does not develop our character, it simply reveals it. The thing that differentiates the people in my book from the average person is that the people in my book had an extra measure of resilience, so that they were able to bounce back from real problems. And so one of the key things that we try to teach in our young people, which I think is really important, is perseverance, or what social scientists now refer to as grit. The ability to stick with something. There's a woman named Angela Duckworth at the University of Pennsylvania who's done probably the best research on grit. And she says, actually there's about 12 attributes that you can develop in young people in their teenage years and their 20s that will increase their likelihood of sticking with something over the long haul. The most important lesson of leadership is allowing the failures and the setbacks that invariably come to not keep you from bouncing back or getting back up on the opportunity. That's really what matters the most.
So with my own a little personal remark after the discussion, I would like to make 3 observations. One is, I think, for the most absolutes of great leadership. I think at the end, maybe if I can think of one word, it's people, right? How you empower, how to lead, how to really inspire people. All right, people to me are always a key word in leadership. And the second observation, I don't know whether Michael agree or not. I think to lead, you must manage yourself first. Right? If you cannot manage yourself well, it's difficult to lead. And my number three, or the last remark, I think many of you may agree, leadership. You can do a lot of lecturing, academic research, but at the end, it's really an art than a science. Right? So it's a lot of things we can further discuss and share. I hope you enjoyed the discussion today. So,